Hello. So today we're going to look at Erik Ericson's stages 6 and 7 of psychosocial development. These are the two stages that really encompass emerging adulthood and adulthood. And so let's take a look. I want you to be able to describe these stages, but more important, I want you to be able to talk about the relationship between each stage, between stages 5, 6, and 7. And the reason why is really encompassed by this quote from Ericson. The strength acquired at any stage is tested by the necessity to transcend it in such a way that the individual can take chances in the next stage with what was most vulnerable and precious in the previous one. So the idea here, and this is kind of the essence of Ericson in each stage, is that what happens in one stage leads to a level of development that the person now has this necessity to transcend, or it inspires them now to push forward into the next stage of development. Right? And whereas at the previous stage, things didn't seem doable or possible, now they become possible. Right? And not just possible, but things that the person actually desires. Okay? We've talked some about development of the brain, and by now you should have some sense that the brain develops medial to lateral from the inside out, so the outer parts of the brain develop slower than the parts inside, and that it develops from posterior or the back forward, posterior to anterior, from the back to the front. Okay? And the last stage part of the brain that really develops is the most anterior, or the prefrontal cortex, really kind of the area kind of encompassed here by my hands and everything. All right. That's an area of the brain that's important for a number of things, but in terms of development relevant to what we're talking about, it's the area that's important for behavioral control, for impulse control. And so, what happens is that part of our brain that's important for control is developing after, or is coming online, fully coming online after development of the parts of the brain that are important for pleasure seeking, for taking chances, for taking risks. Okay? Now, there's lots of downsides to that, right? So, lots of risk taking can be dangerous, leads to injury, leads to death, leads to alcohol, drug abuse, unsafe sex. I mean, you name it. There's all kinds of problems associated with adolescence, young adulthood. And the truth is, many of those carry on well into adulthood. Levels of binge drinking really don't come down till the mid-30s. Right? So in the mid-30s, they finally start coming down to the level they are in the under 21 group. Okay? So, there's this negative side to the way the brain develops. But, we have to ask the question, in terms of functionality, why does it happen that way? Right? So we can ask the kind of counter argument, what would life be like, or what would development be like, if the part of the brain important for behavioral control developed before the parts that are important for pleasure seeking? Right? And we can't really answer that. Right? We can just speculate on what might happen. But the general idea is that the way the brain develops the way it does is it allows adolescents and young adults, and really well into the beginning of what we're calling adulthood, the 25, 30, 35 area, that what it does is it allows us to take chances. It allows us to move out of what we're comfortable in exploring new things. And it's that exploration that allows us to develop the sense of identity, allows us to start thinking new ways, to test our own beliefs, find those, begin seeking intimacy. Obviously not always in terms of really seeking relationships, but ultimately leading to that sense of a relationship and wanting to be with someone long term. Okay? So without if it developed the other way, it might impede that development of self and our leaving home and finding ourselves. Right? Again, we can't really test that because we can't create someone who, create an experiment where people develop in a different way than what we do. But that's the thought behind it. And that kind of thought, that it's because of the way the brain develops, it allows us to go out and explore things, and that exploration leads to maturation. Is the same kind of, is in a sense what Ericson is talking about in this quote, right? That it's by finding our sense of identity, it allows us to develop a sense of intimacy, and developing that sense of intimacy, now we want to give back to the next generation. All right, so let's take a look at that. All right, I'm going to get rid of me here. Hopefully I hit the right button. All right, so stage 5, which we talked about in adolescence, is identity versus role confusion. Stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation. All right, and the essence here, at least as far as Ericson is concerned, is that identity development, which is stage 5, leads to the need to merge one's identity with another. Okay, Ericson talks about the young adult, having developed identity, is eager to merge his identity with another. All right. I think some people are more eager than others. I put it off as long as I could. All right. But this is the sense. It's identity development that leads to the need for intimacy and the ability to create that relationship with someone else. Okay? Because without that sense of identity, we don't have the sense of self to give ourselves to others. All right? So you need your own sense of self to be able to merge yourself with someone else. Otherwise, there's this fear that they're taken away from you. Right, and through that fear then leads to isolation rather than intimacy. Right? So here's his definition of intimacy, and to me, I've added the bold here because I think that's the key part of it. So it's the capacity to commit. And again, Ericson, product of his time, the capacity to commit himself, obviously, or herself, to concentrate affiliations and partnerships, and to develop the ethical strength to abide by such commitments, even though they may call for significant sacrifices. So it's not just committing yourself to someone else, right? But it's by ethical strength, it's that commitment to monogamy, to staying faithful to that person, despite whatever sacrifices are there. All right, and that's the nature of relationship. When you get in a relationship, you give up a part of yourself. All right? Now, isolation, on the other hand, is trying to avoid all that, and it's based but underneath all that becomes this fear of remaining alone and unrecognized. And some of you may know this from personal experience, but if you have that fear or that sense of isolation, you can be alone in a crowd, right? So it's intimacy that allows you to feel part of other things, not just a relationship with one other person, but with others in general, okay? All right. So, Ericson gives a long list of what encompasses intimacy. I edited a little bit because of his wording. Ericson, again, was a Freudian, and he's a product of his time, so I've edited it to make it a little more within our time. But underneath all this is the idea intimacy is much more than sex. Even sex is much more than just sex, right? That there's a mutuality, a mutual giving to each other. Right? The virtue that develops from resolving this crisis towards intimacy is love. Right? And so there is in this sense of affiliation with others that involves mutuality, right? It's not just that I get, but I give, right? That we both benefit in some way. We both sacrifice in some way, mutuality. And that's done with a loved partner. And again, this is the idea of this ethical sense, that there's a mutual trust with each other. And that we're able and willing to regulate the cycles of work, procreation, and recreation. So, there's much in Ericson that's really, again, product of his time, talking about himself, herself, emphasizing heterosexual over homosexual relationships. But this, to me, is really progressive, right? Maybe I'm overreading Ericson here, but there's the sharing of work, there's the sharing of recreation, of procreation. That both people are giving, both people are sacrificing in that. And for the 1950s, I think that's really progressive. But the ultimate goal of this is to give to the offspring, right? So that now, which is really the next stage that we're moving towards, right? So in developing this relationship of mutuality with someone else, now it leads us to the stage where we're able to give back. Right? Whereas with isolation, for Ericson, the sense of isolation is really the root of all character problems in adulthood. Right? It's not that we just reject others, but underneath that we're rejecting ourselves. This is the basis of personality disorders, like borderline personality, where people can be really labile, tend to create really conflictual relationships, and elitism, that then affects the ability to parent and to give to others. Right. Which brings us to stage 7. This is the last stage of adulthood. There's one more stage that we'll talk about in later adulthood. But having developed a sense of intimacy, now people develop, that leads them to the next stage where they're able now to develop a sense of generativity, or a giving back to others. We move from virtue of love to the virtue of care. Okay, and isolated, it begins affectability to give back to others. Right. One of the things I like about Ericson, or at least what Ericson writes, is that he makes a point. It's not just that the young are dependent on adults, but adults are dependent on the young. Right? Those of you who are parents, you know what you're getting from your kids. Yeah, it's not just that you're giving back, but there's something in that relationship that kind of transcends just parent-child. There is something that you gain from it. Yeah. I will never forget the first time I stared at my oldest daughter right after she was born, and just the sense of love, of care, and even my own identity just expanded. It was the first time I realized I could do something good in my life. Right? So adults are dependent on the young. Now what he always points out is there's a healthy dependence on young, and then an unhealthy. Right? So seeing my daughter, it's like, okay, I can do something good. But to constantly use your children to create that sense of self becomes something negative in all of this. Right? So, basic quote from Ericson: mature man needs to be needed, and maturity needs guidance as well as encouragement from what has been produced and must be taken care of. Adults need to nurture and guide. They need to take care of others. But without that sense of intimacy that developed from the previous stage, then it becomes hard to care for others, right? And to give in a healthy way. Generativity goes much beyond just parenting. It's also about work, about creativity. I thought a little bit about that this weekend as I was volunteering at a race. It's giving back to others. When you work at a aid station in a race, you're providing, fuel, you're providing fluids, you're providing encouragement. And when you're in the race, all of that just helps you keep going, especially when you're talking about really long distances and stuff like that. But it's that giving back and forth is generativity. And things change at some point. It's not just that you're giving to your kids, but at some point you may be giving that care to your parents as they get older and are less able to take care of themselves. All right, so that's stages 6 and 7. And again, it's in developing a sense of identity, it leads to a sense of intimacy. Intimacy leads to generativity. Without role confusion leads to isolation. Isolation leads to stagnation. Okay. Now that's not automatic. You can, in the next stage, right, begin to, even though you haven't fully developed your sense of identity, doesn't mean that you can't move towards intimacy in the next stage. It's just now it becomes harder. You don't have the same foundation. Okay? Our last stage that we'll talk about as we get to adulthood is actually a stage that allows you to kind of think back and resolve whatever wasn't worked out in each of these stages. And the truth is, we're all somewhere between intimacy and isolation, between generativity and stagnation, between identity and role confusion. It's not like we really come out 100% one way at any stage. Okay, so it's in later adulthood that you can go back, kind of work through all that, and really develop that sense of all of these things. Okay. All right. You may have grown up reading the Family Circus and the Sunday comics. Turns out the early Family Circus was a little more edgy than probably what the Family Circus that you grew up in. So I thought this was kind of funny. Y'all have a good rest of the week and take care.